Sometimes the greatest act of love is asking a stranger to protect what matters most to you. When a desperate brother carries his terrified sister to the doorstep of an exiled warrior, his plea echoes with the weight of every sibling who has ever feared for their family's safety. Alrik begs Jorund Halfdanarson, "Sir, if they come, hide my sister." He tells of raiders from the east who burn villages and take women. Jorund says nothing. He picks up his axe. When the raiders arrive, they expect to find a helpless old man. Instead, they discover a giant who earned his name the Mountain in battle. This exiled warrior will not hide anyone. He will fight. What happens when the most feared raiders in the eastern lands learn they've cornered not prey but a predator? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stronghold of Jorund Halfdanarson sat like a sleeping giant, carved from the very bones of the earth itself. Perched on a wind-swept plateau, where the mist-soaked borderlands met the unforgiving northern mountains, it commanded a view that stretched for leagues in every direction. Stone walls, weathered by countless winters, rose 30 feet from the rocky ground, their surfaces scarred by time, but unbroken by any siege. Above the main gate, mounted on iron spikes driven deep into granite, hung a massive warhammer that caught the morning light like a promise of violence. The locals called it Skull Crusher, and even in retirement, it seemed to thrum with the memory of battles long past. Inside these walls, Jorund moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned that every action carried consequence. At 53 winters, he stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders still capable of bearing the weight of full battle gear, though he had not worn it for 7 years. His beard, once golden as summer wheat, now carried streaks of silver that spoke of wisdom earned through loss. Deep blue eyes, pale as winter ice, held depths that few dared to explore. Those who had known him in his warrior days said those eyes had once burned with the fury of a berserker. Now they reflected something quieter, but no less dangerous, the controlled power of a man who had chosen peace, but had not. Forgotten war, the great hall where Jorund spent his days stretched 40 paces from end to end, its vaulted ceiling supported by massive oak beams, blackened with age and smoke. Along the walls hung shields and weapons from campaigns across the known world, Damascus steel from the southern kingdoms, Celtic bronze from the western isles, and iron forged in the heart of the Northlands, where legends were born in fire and blood. Each piece told a story, and together they formed the chronicle of a warrior who had stood against impossible odds and emerged victorious time and again. But it was the small things that revealed the man Jorund had become. A wooden cup, carved by his own hands from oak that had grown on his family's land. A simple wool blanket, dyed the deep blue of his home fjord, folded carefully at the foot of his sleeping furs. 3 books, written in Latin by monks who understood that wisdom could be as sharp as any blade. These belongings spoke of a man who had traded glory for solitude, who had chosen exile not as punishment, but as penance. The fire in the central hearth burned low, casting dancing shadows across stone walls that had witnessed both celebration and sorrow. On quiet evenings, Jorund would sit before those flames and remember, not the battles that had made him famous, but the faces of those who had died, so he could claim victory. He had been called many names: the Mountain, the Kingbreaker, the Wolf of the Northern Seas. But the name that haunted his dreams was the one his daughter had whispered in her final moments: Papa. 7 years ago, while Jorund had been fighting in the eastern campaigns, raiders had swept down from the frozen wastes like wolves scenting blood. His hall had burned. His wife had died defending their home. His daughter, barely 8 winters old, had been taken by men who saw innocence as nothing more than merchandise to be sold in distant slave markets. When Jorund returned to find only ash and graves, something inside him had broken beyond repair. The revenge that followed had been swift and absolute. Jorund had tracked the raiders across 3 kingdoms, leaving a trail of corpses that became legend in taverns and mead halls throughout the Northlands. But when he finally found the men responsible, when he finally held his daughter's bones in his hands, the victory tasted of nothing but dust and regret. All his strength, all his skill, all his fearsome reputation, none of it had been enough to save the one life that mattered most. That was the day Jorund Halfdanarson had died to the world. The mountain had walked away from glory, from gold, from the brotherhood of warriors who had followed him through 100 battles. He had come to this stronghold, built by his grandfather's grandfather, and sworn an oath that his fighting days were done. Here on the edge of civilization, he would tend his small garden, maintain his walls, and trouble no man unless that man first troubled him. For 7 years that oath had held. Traders passed safely through his lands. Travelers found shelter in his hall. Even bandits learned to give the mountain's territory a wide berth, not from fear of his blade, but out of respect for a man who had earned his solitude through suffering. Jorund had found a kind of peace in this exile, a quiet that soothed wounds that would never fully heal. But peace, as Jorund had learned, was a fragile thing. The morning mist still clung to the valley floor when the first figure appeared on the eastern trail. Jorund spotted him from the watchtower, where he performed his daily survey of the approaches to his stronghold. Even at this distance, he could see the man's exhaustion in the way he stumbled and caught himself against the rocks that lined the path. Behind him, moving more carefully, came a smaller figure, a woman or perhaps a young man, helping the wounded traveler maintain his balance. Jorund's hand went instinctively to the leather-wrapped handle of the sayax at his belt. 7 years of peace had not dulled his warrior's instincts. These travelers approached from the east, the direction of the borderlands where wolves ran in larger packs, and men often proved worse than beasts. Their clothing, even at this distance, showed the dark stains that could only be blood. They moved with the desperate urgency of people fleeing something terrible. By the time the pair reached his gates, Jorund had already decided to offer them sanctuary. It was not kindness that motivated this decision. Kindness was a luxury he could no longer afford. It was something deeper, something that connected to the part of him that would always hear his daughter's voice calling for protection that never came. The man who collapsed against the iron-bound oak of Jorund's gate was perhaps 30 winters old, with the calloused hands and sun-weathered face of a farmer. His woolen tunic, once the warm brown of good earth, was torn in 3 places and stained with blood, both fresh and dried. A crude bandage wrapped around his left thigh had soaked through, and his face carried the grey pallor of a man who had lost more blood than was wise. "Please," the farmer gasped as Jorund approached. "My name is Alrik Torson. This is my sister Svala. You need food, clean water, and someone to tend that wound properly," Jorund interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Save your words, for when you have strength to speak them." The woman, Svala, stepped forward then, and Jorund felt something shift in his chest like ice cracking on a spring river. She could not have seen more than 20 winters, but her eyes held the fierce intelligence of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Auburn hair, braided in the practical style of working women, framed a face that would have been beautiful if not for the fear that shadowed her features. She moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to physical work, but there was something else in her bearing, a readiness, as if she expected trouble to follow her even here. "Sir," she said, her voice clear despite the tremor of exhaustion, "we are grateful for your kindness, but you must know, we did not come here by choice. We came because there was nowhere else to run." Jorund studied her face, noting the way her hand rested on the handle of a small knife at her belt. Good, she had the sense to arm herself, even if that arm would prove useless against the kind of men who typically pursued refugees. "Run from what?" he asked. Alrik struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against his sister's shoulder. "Raiders, my lord, from the eastern wastes. They came 3 days ago, struck our village at dawn, burned everything, took—" His voice broke, and he gathered himself with visible effort. "They took the women and children they wanted, killed the rest. My wife, she was with child, sir. She could not run fast enough." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jorund felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the echo of his own loss reverberating through this stranger's grief. 7 years had not been long enough to forget how it felt to lose everything that mattered. How many? Jorund asked, and his voice carried a new edge that made both siblings look at him more carefully. 40 men, perhaps 50, Alrik replied. Led by one they call Grimvar the Red. They wear no king's colours, follow no lord's banner. They are wolves, sir, and they hunt in a pack. Svala stepped closer to her brother, her eyes never leaving Jorund's face. We heard stories in the taverns, she said quietly. Stories of a warrior who lives alone in the borderlands. A giant they once called the Mountain. We hoped you hoped for protection, Jorund finished. He looked at these 2 young people, refugees from a tragedy that was repeated too often in these wild lands, and felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like armor he had tried to lay aside. You hoped that the stories were true. Alrik dropped to his knees then, ignoring the pain that lanced through his wounded leg. Sir, if they come, and they will come, for they never leave prey alive to spread word of their coming, I beg you, hide my sister. I will stand and fight beside you, wounded as I am, but Svala, she deserves to live beyond this day. Jorund looked down at the kneeling farmer, at the young woman whose hand had moved from her knife to her brother's shoulder in a gesture of support that spoke of love deeper than blood. He thought of oaths spoken in grief, of promises made to the dead, of the 7 years of peace that had somehow failed to heal the wound in his soul. Then he turned away from them both and walked to where Skullcrusher hung above his gate. The warhammer that had broken the shield walls of 3 armies, that had crushed the skulls of berserkers and champions, that had earned him a reputation written in blood across 2 kingdoms. His hand closed around the worn leather grip, and for the first time in 7 years, the weapon felt like coming home. When he turned back to face Alrik and Svala, they saw something different in his pale blue eyes. Not the quiet resignation of a man who had chosen exile, but the cold fire of a warrior who had just remembered why he had once been called the Mountain. I will not hide your sister, Jorund said, his voice carrying across the courtyard like the rumble of distant thunder. But I will stand between her and any man who would do her harm. That is my promise to you both. Alrik's face crumpled with relief, but Svala continued to study Jorund with those intelligent eyes. You mean to fight them, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Jorund replied simply. I mean to fight them. And somewhere in the distance, like an echo of things to come, the wind carried the sound of hoofbeats on the eastern trail. The truth came in pieces, like fragments of a shattered mirror reflecting horror in jagged glimpses. As Svala cleaned her brother's wounds with water heated over Jorund's fire, Alrik's story emerged through gritted teeth and fevered whispers that painted a picture darker than either sibling had initially revealed. It wasn't random. Alrik gasped as his sister pressed a clean cloth against the gash in his thigh. They knew exactly which houses to strike first, which families had daughters worth taking, where the grain stores were hidden. Someone had been watching our village for weeks. Jorund, who had been checking the leather bindings on a crossbow that had not been strung in 7 years, looked up sharply. You think you had a spy among you? Worse than that, Svala said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Around her neck hung a delicate silver pendant, the only thing of value she had managed to save from their flight. A piece worked with intricate knotwork that spoke of their mother's love and careful craftsmanship. They knew our mother's burial customs, knew which day our father would be traveling to the next valley for trade. They struck when our defenses were weakest, when most of our men were away. The implications settled over the great hall like a winter chill. Jorund had fought enough campaigns to recognize the hallmarks of a planned assault, but this level of intelligence suggested something beyond mere raiding. This was conquest, systematic and thorough. How long have they been watching your lands? He asked. Alrik tried to shift his position and winced as fresh pain shot through his leg. Months, perhaps. There were signs, tracks where there should have been none, livestock that went missing without sign of wolves, travelers who asked too many questions about our habits and defenses. We thought them coincidences. Grimvar the Red does not leave such things to chance, Jorund said, and there was something in his tone that made both siblings look at him more carefully. You know of him? I know his reputation. He learned his craft in the eastern slave markets, where efficiency means profit and witnesses mean trouble. If he has been planning this assault for months, then your village was never the true target. Svala's hand went instinctively to her pendant, fingers tracing the silver links as if they could somehow connect her to the mother who had worn it before her. What do you mean? Jorund set down the crossbow and moved to the great window that looked out over the eastern approaches to his stronghold. The mist was beginning to lift from the valleys below, revealing the network of trails and paths that connected his isolated domain to the wider world. A man like Grimvar does not spend months planning the conquest of a single farming village. The gold and slaves he might take would not justify the investment of time and men. He was after something else, but what? Alrik asked, struggling to sit up straighter despite his sister's protests. We had nothing of great value. Our harvest was good, but not exceptional. Our women were... His voice broke as he remembered his pregnant wife, and he had to gather himself before continuing. We were simple people, sir. We troubled no one. Your location, Jorund said quietly. Your village sits at the confluence of 3 trade routes, commands the eastern pass through the mountains, and lies within striking distance of 6 other settlements. Take your village, and a man has a base from which to launch attacks across the entire eastern borderland. The weight of this revelation settled over them like a burial shroud. Svala's face went pale as she realized the implications. You mean our friends, our neighbors in the other villages? They are likely already dead or enslaved, Jorund confirmed, with the brutal honesty of a man who had seen too much war to offer false comfort. Grimvar will have sent teams to strike them, while their attention was focused on the smoke rising from your burning homes. Alrik's hands clenched into fists. And when he spoke, his voice carried a rage that transformed him from wounded refugee to something harder. How long do we have? Jorund studied the eastern trail, his experienced eye reading the landscape like a battle map. They will have paused to secure their conquests, divide their spoils, tend their wounded. But they know you escaped, wounded prey that might carry word to others who could organize resistance. They will come. How long? Svala pressed. Hours, not days. If I were Grimvar, I would send my fastest riders ahead to scout this stronghold, while the main force finish their work in the villages. By sunset, we will have company. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant whistle of wind through the mountain peaks. Alrik looked at his sister, seeing in her face the same mixture of fear and determination that had carried them through 3 days of desperate flight. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite the pain that clouded his eyes. Sir, we have brought this trouble to your door. If you wish us to leave to face our fate elsewhere, I would understand. You owe us nothing. Jorund turned from the window to face them both, and in his pale blue eyes they saw the ghost of the warrior he had once been stirring to life. Do you think me a coward, farmer? No, sir, Alrik replied quickly. But you are one man and they are many. Even the mountain cannot— The mountain, Jorund interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of dark humor, has faced worse odds than 50 raiders drunk on easy victory. The question is not whether I can stop them. The question is whether you are prepared for what stopping them will require. Svala rose from where she knelt beside her brother, her hand still clutching her mother's pendant. We have already lost everything that mattered to us. What more could we lose? Your innocence, Jorund said bluntly. War is not the clean thing that skalds sing about in their verses. It is ugly and brutal, and it stains everyone it touches. If you stay here, if you stand with me when they come, you will see things that will haunt your dreams for whatever years remain to you. And if we run, Alrik asked, they will hunt you down like animals, and you will die badly after they have taken from you everything they can use. The choice hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Svala looked at her wounded brother, at the man who had offered them sanctuary when the world had turned to ash and blood, at the silver pendant that represented all they had lost and all they still hoped to preserve. "We stay," she said simply. Alrik nodded, his jaw set with grim determination. "We stay." Jorund studied them both for a long moment, seeing in their faces the echo of choices he had made long ago when he was young enough to believe that courage alone could triumph over any odds. "Then we prepare," he said, moving toward the weapons that lined his walls. "And we prepare quickly." The transformation that followed was like watching a sleeping giant wake to find his house on fire. Jorund moved through his stronghold with the efficiency of a man whose survival had once depended on such preparations, and every action revealed new layers of the warrior he had tried to leave behind. Weapons were cleaned and sharpened, armor was checked for weak points, and the defenses of the stronghold were examined with an eye toward turning every advantage into a killing ground. Svala proved surprisingly adept at understanding Jorund's tactical thinking, asking intelligent questions about sightlines and escape routes that demonstrated a practical mind unencumbered by romantic notions about warfare. Alrik, despite his wound, insisted on helping where he could, his farmer's knowledge of tools and construction proving valuable as they reinforced doors and prepared makeshift barriers. But it was when Jorund opened the great chest in his private chambers that the true weight of their situation became clear. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather against the mountain damp, lay the armor of the mountain. Mail rings linked with a skill that spoke of master craftsmanship, a helm that had turned aside the strokes of champions, gauntlets scarred by countless battles but still strong enough to crush bone. As Jorund lifted each piece from its resting place, Alrik and Svala saw him not as the quiet exile who had offered them shelter, but as the legend who had earned his fearsome reputation in blood and fire across 2 kingdoms. The man who donned this armor would not be the one who had spent 7 years tending a garden and seeking peace. "Sir," Svala said quietly, as Jorund began the familiar ritual of arming himself. "When Grimvar comes, what do we call you?" Jorund paused in his preparations, his hands still for a moment on the leather straps that would secure his life to his body. When he looked at them, his eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire battles, victories and defeats measured in the lives of men who had stood against him and fallen. "When they come," he said, his voice carrying the cold certainty of approaching winter, "you call me what they will learn to call me before this day is done. You call me Death." In the distance, carried on the evening wind like a promise of violence, came the sound of hoofbeats on stone. The raiders of Grimvar the Red had found their trail, and the mountain was about to remember why legends are written in blood. The inner keep of Jorund's stronghold had been carved from living rock by his ancestors, men who understood that survival in the borderlands required both strength and cunning. As he guided Alrik and Svala through the narrow passages that led to its heart, Jorund's mind was already calculating angles of attack, defensive positions, and the dozen ways a determined enemy might breach his walls. "This is where you will make your stand, if the outer defenses fall," he told them, indicating a chamber whose single entrance could be held by one man against many. The walls were lined with alcoves that held supplies, water barrels, dried meat, weapons and oil for lamps that could burn for days. The passage behind that tapestry leads to a cave system that emerges 3 miles north. "If I fall, you take that route and do not look back." Svala ran her hand along the smooth stone of the wall, feeling the craftsmanship of generations past. "Your family built this place to last." "My family built this place to protect what mattered to them," Jorund corrected. "Stone and mortar mean nothing without purpose." On the rough wooden table in the center of the chamber, Alrik carefully laid out the simple tools he had managed to save from their flight, a hammer worn smooth by years of honest work, chisels that had shaped countless fence posts and tool handles, a measuring cord that had marked furrows in fields that would never again know the plow. These implements, so ordinary in their original purpose, seemed almost sacred in this place where desperate plans took shape. "Tell me about your farm." Jorund said as he began sorting through a collection of crossbow bolts, checking each one for straightness and balance. I need to understand how a man like Grimvar learned so much about your village. Alrik's face darkened as he remembered. We had visitors throughout the summer, traders mostly, but also pilgrims heading to the monastery at Raven's Hollow, soldiers seeking work, even a bard who entertained us for 3 nights with songs of distant lands. Any one of them could have been marking our defenses. The bard, Svala said suddenly. He asked many questions about our customs, our holy days, when our men traveled for trade. At the time, I thought he was simply gathering material for new songs. Jorund nodded grimly. Spies often wear the faces of entertainment. A bard can go anywhere, ask any question, and people think nothing of sharing their secrets with someone who claims to preserve them in verse. He selected a particularly well-balanced bolt and sighted along its length. Did this bard have any distinguishing features? Tall, thin, with a scar across his left cheek that he claimed came from a jealous husband, Alrik replied. He carried a harp of unusual design, black wood with silver strings. I know of him, Jorund said, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. Hearken the song weaver. He gathers intelligence for whoever pays his price, and his information has led to the fall of 3 settlements that I know of. If he was among you, then Grimvar knew every weakness of your village before he ever gave the order to attack. The implications of this betrayal settled over them like a shroud. Svala's hand went to her mother's pendant, and when she spoke, her voice carried a bitter edge. We welcomed him into our homes, shared our food, listened to his songs. My sister-in-law clapped along to his music the very night before. She could not finish the sentence. Betrayal is a weapon like any other, Jorund said gently. And like any weapon, it cuts deepest when wielded by those we trust. The fault lies not with you for offering hospitality, but with him for abusing it. As the afternoon light began to fade beyond the narrow windows of the keep, Jorund led them back to the outer courtyard, where the real work of preparation began. The stronghold's defenses had been designed by men who understood that in the borderlands, every advantage must be pressed to its limit. Walls that seemed merely decorative concealed murder holes through which arrows could rain down on attackers. Seemingly solid sections of the courtyard floor could be lifted to reveal pits lined with sharpened stakes. The very stones beneath their feet had been arranged to channel attackers into killing zones, where crossfire would make survival impossible. Your ancestors were thorough, Alrik observed as Jorund demonstrated the mechanisms that controlled these defenses. My ancestors were survivors, Jorund replied. They understood that in war, the difference between victory and defeat often lies in preparation done long before the enemy arrives, but it was when Jorund began checking the approaches to his stronghold that his true tactical genius became apparent. What had seemed like natural formations in the landscape, fallen boulders, twisted trees, even the very contours of the hillside, had been subtly modified over generations to create a maze of obstacles that would force any attacking. Forced to move exactly where the defenders wanted them, the main trail splits here, Jorund explained, pointing to a section of path that forked around a massive granite outcropping. Most commanders would assume the larger path is the main route and send their forces that way. But the smaller path actually leads to better ground for assault. It just takes longer to navigate. Svala studied the terrain with the practical eye of someone who had spent her life reading the land. So you force them to choose between speed and position. Exactly. And while they debate that choice, they are exposed on open ground, where a single archer can pin down a dozen men. Jorund indicated a stone ledge, barely visible among the rocks above. My grandfather spent 2 seasons carving that position. It looks natural, but it provides perfect cover and a commanding view of both approaches. Alrik shook his head in amazement. How many generations planned for this day? Every generation since the first Halfdanarson claimed this peak, Jorund answered. We have always known that eventually someone would come who wanted what we had badly enough to kill for it. The only question was whether we would be ready. As they worked to prepare the final elements of the stronghold's defenses, a comfortable rhythm developed between the three of them. Svala proved surprisingly knowledgeable about the practical aspects of siege warfare. Knowledge that came, she explained, from listening to her grandfather's stories of the last great war that had swept through these lands. Alrik's farmer's strength and understanding of mechanical principles made him invaluable in setting the traps and mechanisms that could multiply the effectiveness of their small force, but it was the growing bond between them that truly strengthened their position. Jorund found himself remembering what it meant to fight not for conquest or glory, but for the protection of those who mattered. In Svala's fierce determination and Alrik's quiet courage, he saw echoes of the family he had lost, and for the first time in 7 years, the weight of his exile began to feel less like penance and more like preparation. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when the first of Grimvar's scouts appeared on the eastern trail. They moved with the casual confidence of men who had faced no real opposition in their recent campaigns, studying the stronghold with the practiced eye of warriors, but without the desperate urgency that would have marked them as anything more than an advance party. Jorund watched them from his concealed position on the ramparts, counting their numbers and noting their equipment. 6 men, he murmured to himself. Well armed, but not heavily armored. They expect to find either an easy target or an empty stronghold. From their position in the courtyard below, Alrik and Svala could not see the scouts, but they could read the tension in Jorund's posture as he tracked their movement through his territory. The waiting had been hard, but this moment when the abstract threat became visible reality was harder still. What do we do? Svala called up softly. Jorund's smile was cold as winter wind. We give them exactly what they expect to see, he replied, and then we show them how wrong they were. The deception began with subtlety that spoke of hard-won experience in the art of war. From his position in the watchtower, Jorund allowed himself to be seen, but only briefly, and only as an ordinary man might be glimpsed going about mundane tasks. He moved with the stooped shoulders of age, carried a walking stick that concealed the balance of a fighting man, and made a show of tending to everyday chores that would suggest nothing more threatening than an isolated hermit. Below in the courtyard, Alrik and Svala played their own parts in the charade. Svala had wrapped her auburn hair in a headscarf and moved with the careful gait of a servant mindful of her place. Alrik, despite his wound, managed to project the appearance of a traveling merchant's guard, competent enough to handle bandits, but hardly a threat to a professional raiding force. They went about their assigned tasks with practiced normalcy, all while keeping weapons close to hand and eyes alert for the signal that would transform them from actors to warriors. In his personal chambers, wrapped carefully in undyed wool and stored in a chest of ancient oak, lay the artifact that connected Jorund most powerfully to the family he had lost. It was a child's toy horse, carved from pine and painted with the bright colors that had once delighted a little girl's eyes. The paint had faded over 7 years, and one of the wooden legs showed the marks where small teeth had worried at it during teething. But to Jorund, it remained perfect in its imperfection. He had taken it from his daughter's burned bedroom, the only thing the flames had not claimed, and carried it with him through every mile of his journey to this stronghold. Now, as he prepared to risk everything for 2 strangers who reminded him of what he had failed to protect, that small wooden horse seemed to watch him with painted eyes that held more judgment than any court of kings. Every choice he made in the hours to come would be weighed against the memory of choices not made, protection not given, love not strong enough to overcome the simple fact that evil men existed in the world. The main raiding force announced itself long before it became visible, a low rumble of hoofbeats and wagon wheels that echoed off the stone walls of the valley like distant thunder. Grimvar the Red had not earned his fearsome reputation through stealth. He was a man who understood that terror could be as effective a weapon as steel, and he led his forces with the confidence of someone who had never faced meaningful opposition. when they finally crested the ridge that overlooked Jorund's stronghold. Even Grimvar's hardened veterans felt a moment of unease. The man they saw tending his small garden did not look like the mountain of legend. Grey-bearded and bent with apparent age, he moved among his vegetables with the careful attention of someone whose greatest concern was whether the late harvest would carry him through the coming winter. It was only when the most observant among them noticed the precise way he moved, the calculated placement of each step, that doubts began to whisper in experienced minds. Grimvar himself was a man who commanded attention without effort. Tall and lean like a hunting wolf, he wore his red hair in the elaborate braids favored by Eastern warriors, each braid bound with gold rings taken from fallen enemies. His armor was a mixture of the practical and the ornate, steel plates that would turn aside any blade, decorated with engravings that told the story of his victories in symbols that needed no translation. The bone-carved drinking horn at his belt, decorated with scenes of conquest and slaughter, had touched the lips of 3 kings before their kingdoms fell to his ambition. "So," Grimvar said, his voice carrying easily across the stone walls, "this is the fortress of the legendary mountain. I confess myself disappointed." Jorund straightened slowly from his garden, one hand pressed to his lower back in a gesture of age-stiffened joints, and looked up at the armed force that had surrounded his home. "You seem to have me at a disadvantage, stranger. I am but a simple man, seeking to live out his years in peace." The laughter that rippled through Grimvar's ranks held no humor, only the cruel amusement of predators who had cornered defenseless prey. Several of the raiders had already begun discussing how they would divide the spoils once this farce was concluded. "Peace," Grimvar repeated, tasting the word like wine gone sour. An interesting choice of words from a man whose very name once struck fear into the hearts of kingdoms. "Tell me, Jorund Halfdanarson, do you truly believe that 7 years of playing farmer has made men forget what you once were?" The admission hung in the air between them like a blade drawn halfway from its sheath. Jorund's pale blue eyes met Grimvar's dark ones across the space that separated them, and for a moment the pretense fell away entirely. "And what is it you believe I once was?" "Death walking in the shape of a man," Grimvar replied. "The mountain who broke the shield wall at Ironford. The berserker who held the bridge at Ravenshollow against 300 men. The warrior whose very presence on a battlefield could turn the tide of kingdoms." He paused, studying Jorund's weathered face. "But that was before grief broke you, before you ran from the world like a whipped dog seeking a hole to die in." The insult was calculated, designed to provoke the kind of rage that would make a man abandon tactical thinking in favor of glorious stupidity. Grimvar had used similar tactics to draw countless enemies into disadvantageous positions, and he watched Jorund's face carefully for signs that the provocation had found its mark. What he saw instead was something that made experienced raiders shift uncomfortably in their saddles. Jorund's expression did not change, but something in his eyes, some quality of stillness that spoke of deep waters running far beneath a calm surface, suggested that the old wolf was not as toothless as he appeared. "You know," Jorund said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than standing on the edge of violence, "I had hoped to spend my remaining years without adding to the count of men I have killed. It seemed like a worthy goal for someone who has spilled enough blood to fill a small lake." He moved then, not with the hesitant steps of age, but with the fluid grace of a man whose body remembered lessons learned in 100 battles. The walking stick he had been leaning on revealed itself to be a war spear, its point sharp enough to pierce mail, its balance perfect for the hand that had once wielded it in the service of kings. "But I find," Jorund continued, his voice carrying a new note that made the horses prance nervously beneath their riders, "that some goals are less worthy than others. Some men require killing, not because they are strong, but because they prey on those who are not." Grimvar's hand went to the sword at his hip, his warrior's instincts finally recognizing the magnitude of his miscalculation. The man before him was not the broken exile his spies had reported. This was the mountain in truth, and he had just walked into a trap 7 years in the making. "Kill him," Grimvar shouted, but his words were lost in the thunder of hoofbeats as his raiders spurred their mounts forward, eager to claim the bounty their leader had placed on the head of the legendary warrior. They had expected to face a tired old man armed with garden tools. Instead, they discovered why legends are written in blood and memory, and why some names echo through the halls of time long after the men who bore them have passed into shadow. The first wave of attackers hit Jorund's outer defenses, like a storm wave breaking against granite cliffs, and learned too late that the mountain had spent 7 years turning his stronghold into a masterpiece of defensive warfare. What appeared to be clear approaches to the walls revealed themselves as carefully constructed killing fields where every step forward brought the raiders deeper into a maze of concealed traps and overlapping fields of fire, the lead riders, eager for the glory of striking down a legend, found their horses stumbling as hidden ropes caught their legs and sent both mount and rider tumbling onto stakes concealed beneath thin coverings of earth and leaves. The screams of wounded animals and the curses of men, caught in snares designed to cripple rather than kill, filled the air with the music of chaos that Jorund knew as well as his own heartbeat from his position. Atop the main gate, crossbow in hand, Jorund moved with the calculated precision of a man who had turned killing into an art form. Each bolt found its mark in the gap between helmet and mail, in the joint where arm met shoulder, in the space beneath the ribs where a blade could reach the heart. He did not waste shots on dramatic kills or impossible targets. Every quarrel that left his weapon took a life, and every life taken reduced the odds against the 3 defenders by 1 more increment. Alrik, stationed at the secondary firing position that overlooked the eastern approach, proved that his years as a farmer had given him skills that translated well to warfare. His crossbow might lack the deadly accuracy of Jorund's, but his bolts found their targets with sufficient frequency to convince several raiders that the stronghold was more heavily defended than initial reports had suggested. The simple farming tools he had carried from his ruined village, hammer, chisel, measuring cord, lay within easy reach, transformed from implements of creation into weapons of defense. But it was Svala who provided the greatest surprise to attackers who had expected to face only an aging warrior and his servants. From her concealed position in the tower that commanded the northern approach, she sent arrow after arrow into the ranks of men who had destroyed her home and murdered her family. Each shaft carried with it not just the skill of someone raised in a land where hunting provided winter meat, but the focused fury of a woman who had lost everything and found in violence the only justice left to her. "They're pulling back," Alrik called out as the surviving raiders retreated beyond the range of their weapons, leaving behind them the groans of wounded men and the thrashing of injured horses. "The first probe," Jorund replied, his voice carrying no satisfaction despite the bodies that littered the approaches to his walls. "Grimvar is learning what we can do. The next attack will be more considered." From their position across the killing field, the raider leader studied the stronghold with new respect. The intelligence his spies had provided had been accurate about the defenses: walls of good stone, clear fields of fire, positions that could be held by a small force against superior numbers. What his sources had failed to convey was the tactical brilliance of the man who had designed those defenses, and the deadly competence of those who now manned them. "How many do you count?" Grimvar asked his lieutenant, a scarred veteran named Thorek, who had survived more battles than most men saw in their entire lives. "We lost 8 in that first rush, with 6 more too wounded to fight effectively," Thorek replied, his voice carrying the respect of a professional warrior for skilled opposition. "But we confirmed what our spies reported: 3 defenders, possibly 4. Even the mountain cannot hold those walls indefinitely against 40 men." Grimvar nodded. But his dark eyes remained fixed on the figure of Jorund, moving along the ramparts with the easy confidence of a man who had faced worse odds and emerged victorious. "Send men around to the north and south. Not to attack, to watch and learn. I want to know every entrance, every weakness, every place where a determined man might find purchase on those walls. And the main assault? Fire," Grimvar said simply. "If we cannot take the stronghold by storm, we will burn them out of it. Even legends must breathe." The respite that followed the first attack gave Jorund time to assess their situation and plan for the escalation he knew would come. Moving through the stronghold with the efficiency of long practice, he checked ammunition supplies, tested the mechanisms that controlled their defensive traps, and ensured that every weapon was clean and ready for the prolonged fight ahead. It was while performing these routine tasks that he encountered Alrik, struggling with feelings that went beyond simple fear of death. The farmer sat in the courtyard, his wounded legs stretched out before him, staring at the blood that stained his hands from the men he had killed in the defense of their position. "I am not a killer," Alrik said quietly as Jorund approached. 3 days ago, the most violence I had ever done was slaughtering a pig for winter meat. Now I have taken the lives of men who had mothers, wives, children waiting for their return. Jorund settled beside him, his pale blue eyes studying the younger man's face with the understanding of someone who had wrestled with similar demons. "Do you regret defending your sister?" "No," Alrik replied without hesitation. "But I regret that the world has become a place where such defense is necessary. That is the difference between a warrior and a killer," Jorund said. "A killer takes life because he enjoys the taking. A warrior takes life because sometimes it is the only way to preserve what matters more than life itself." Svala joined them then, moving down from her firing position with the controlled grace of someone who had discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. Around her neck, her mother's silver pendant caught the light from the setting sun, its intricate knotwork seeming to pulse with the rhythm of her breathing. "They are planning something," she said, settling beside her brother and checking the bandage on his wounded thigh. "I can see them moving beyond the tree line, but they are staying well clear of our weapons." "Fire arrows," Jorund said with the certainty of someone who had both used and faced such tactics. "They mean to burn us out, force us into the open where their numbers will tell." Alrik looked up sharply. "Can they succeed?" "The outer buildings will burn," Jorund admitted. "But the keep itself is carved from living stone, and the roof is slate quarried from these very mountains. Fire can make us uncomfortable, but it cannot reach us if we retreat to the inner defenses." "Then why do you look troubled?" Svala asked, her intelligent eyes reading the concern in Jorund's expression. "Because fire will destroy the food stores, the water barrels, everything we need to sustain a siege," Jorund replied. "Grimvar is not trying to kill us quickly. He is trying to kill us slowly, to force us to come out and face his superior numbers when hunger and thirst have weakened us beyond the point where skill can overcome raw strength. The implications of this strategy settled over them like the gathering dusk. They had won the first engagement through superior position and tactical advantage, but the enemy commander had learned from his losses and was adapting his approach accordingly. The real test of their resolve was yet to come. As if summoned by their discussion, the first flight of fire arrows rose from the raiders' position like a constellation of falling stars. They struck the wooden portions of the stronghold's outer buildings with the hungry crackle of flames finding fuel. And within minutes, the entire compound was illuminated by the orange glow of structures that had stood for generations, being reduced to ash and memory. "It begins," Jorund said, watching his grandfather's workshop, consumed by flames that painted dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. "Now we learn what we are truly made of." The ancient runestones that marked the boundaries of the Halfdanarson stronghold stood like silent sentinels in the flickering light of the burning outbuildings, their carved symbols seeming to pulse with meaning in the dancing shadows. These weathered monuments, placed by Jorund's ancestors to mark not just territory but sacred obligation, bore inscriptions in the old tongue that spoke of oaths sworn to protect the innocent and stand against the darkness that periodically swept down from the eastern wastes. Now, as flames consumed the workshop where 5 generations of his family had crafted tools and weapons, Jorund felt the weight of those ancient promises settling on his shoulders like armor forged from duty itself. The smoke that rose from his burning property carried with it the scent of memories, the sweet smell of pine shavings from his grandfather's wood carvings, the acrid tang of heated metal from the forge, where his father had taught him to shape iron, the earthy aroma of dried herbs from his mother's garden. The coordinated assault that Grimvar launched under cover of the fire proved that the raider leader had learned from his earlier defeats. Instead of the wild charge that had marked his first probe, this attack came in disciplined waves designed to test different sections of the stronghold's defenses simultaneously. Groups of 5 or 6 men approached from multiple angles, each team equipped with scaling ladders, grappling hooks, and the kind of siege equipment that spoke of extensive experience in reducing fortified positions. From the main tower, Jorund coordinated the defense with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced such challenges before. His voice carried clearly over the sounds of battle as he directed Alrik's fire toward the teams threatening the eastern wall and guided Svala's arrows toward raiders attempting to establish a foothold on the northern ramparts. Each command was precise, economical, designed to maximize the effectiveness of their limited numbers against an enemy that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. "Southern wall," he called to Alrik, who had managed to climb to his assigned position despite the wound that still hampered his movement. 3 men with a ram. Take the leader, the others will lose heart. The crossbow bolt that answered this instruction flew true, catching the designated target in the throat and sending him tumbling backward into his companions. The improvised battering ram, little more than a trimmed log with iron bands, fell from nerveless fingers as the remaining raiders scrambled for cover behind what little protection the courtyard afforded. But for every small victory, the defenders faced a dozen new challenges. The fire arrows continued to fall like deadly rain, forcing them to divide their attention between fighting flames and fighting men. Smoke filled the courtyards and passages, making accurate shooting difficult and turning familiar terrain into a maze of shadows and confusion. Worst of all, the water they needed to combat the fires was the same water they would need to survive if the siege stretched into days or weeks. Svala, her face streaked with soot and her auburn hair escaping from its practical braid, appeared at Jorund's side during a brief lull in the fighting. "The granary is lost," she reported, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what those words meant. "The flames reached the roof before we could get water to it." Jorund absorbed this news with the stoicism of a man who had learned that dwelling on losses only multiplied them. "The root cellar? Still secure, but the smoke is making it difficult to reach. If they maintain this pressure, we will have to choose between fighting the fires and fighting the men." "Then we choose the men," Jorund said without hesitation. "Buildings can be rebuilt. Lives cannot be restored." It was then that Alrik appeared, supporting himself on a makeshift crutch carved from a piece of burned timber. His farmer's clothes were blackened with smoke, and his face showed the strain of maintaining his position, despite wounds that should have left him bedridden. But his eyes held a determination that spoke of something deeper than mere stubbornness. "There is something you should know," he said, his voice carrying a gravity that made both Jorund and Svala give him their full attention. "While I was covering the eastern approach, I heard the raiders talking. They are not just random sellswords following Grimvar for plunder." "What do you mean?" Svala asked. Some of them wore tokens, arm rings, pendants, that marked them as oaths sworn to specific lords. Eastern lords whose lands border on kingdoms that have reason to fear the return of the mountain to active warfare. The implications of this revelation struck Jorund like a physical blow. He had assumed that this attack was motivated by simple greed, the desire of raiders to claim his stronghold and use it as a base for further depredations. But if Alrik was correct, if some of these men served lords who remembered his reputation from the old campaigns, then this assault was something far more dangerous than mere banditry. "They mean to ensure that the mountain never rises again," he said quietly. "This is not about conquest, it is about elimination." Svala's hand went instinctively to her mother's pendant, her fingers tracing the silver links, as if they could somehow connect her to wisdom that might help them understand this new dimension of their peril. "But why now? You have been in exile for 7 years. What changed?" "Word travels, even to the borderlands," Jorund replied. "Perhaps someone heard that refugees had sought shelter in my stronghold. Perhaps they feared that protecting the innocent might awaken something in me that they preferred to remain dormant. Or perhaps," Alrik suggested grimly, "they always intended to come for you eventually, and our arrival simply provided them with the excuse they needed." The sound of renewed assault interrupted their conversation as Grimvar launched another wave of attackers against the southern wall. This time, however, the raiders came prepared for the defenses that had cost them so dearly in previous attempts. They carried shields of overlapping wood and leather that could turn aside crossbow bolts, wore mail shirts that would deflect all but the most perfectly placed arrows, and moved with the coordinated precision of men who had studied their target's weaknesses and adapted their tactics accordingly. From his position on the ramparts, Jorund watched this new assault develop with the professional interest of a warrior who respected skilled opposition even as he prepared to defeat it. These men were no longer the confident raiders who had first surrounded his stronghold, expecting easy victory. They had been bloodied, tested, and taught the cost of underestimating their target. Now they came as professionals, and professionals were always more dangerous than amateurs, regardless of which side they served. "They learn quickly," he murmured to himself, then raised his voice to carry to his companions. "New tactics. Watch for men with shields. They will try to get close enough to use axes on the gates." The battle that followed tested every lesson that years of warfare had burned into Jorund's memory. Gone was the wild chaos of the first assault, replaced by the methodical precision of siegecraft applied by men who understood both its possibilities and its limitations. Raiders worked in teams to suppress defensive fire, while engineers, for that was what they were, regardless of their irregular status, attempted to breach the stronghold's defenses through applied leverage rather than brute force. But if the attackers had learned from their defeats, so too had the defenders grown in skill and confidence. Alrik's crossbow work, guided by hard-won experience and natural aptitude, began to find the gaps in enemy shields with increasing frequency. Svala's arrows, loosed from positions that changed constantly to prevent counterfire, struck with the precision of someone who had discovered that accuracy mattered more than speed when every shot counted. And Jorund himself moved through the battle like a force of nature, given human form, his war spear drinking deeply from the ranks of men who had made the mistake of believing that legends could be conquered by mere numbers. Each thrust of his weapon carried with it the accumulated skill of decades spent perfecting the art of war. And each fallen enemy served as a reminder to the living that some reputations were earned rather than invented. As the night wore on and the attacks continued to break against the strongholds, defenses like waves against an unforgiving shore, even Grimvar's veterans began to question whether their leader's ambition had led them into a trap from which there might be no escape. The mountain had awakened, and his fury was proving to be everything the old songs claimed and more. The discovery came in the pale light of dawn, when exhaustion and smoke had dulled the senses of defenders who had fought through the night against waves of increasingly desperate attacks. Svala, making her way through the ruins of the outer courtyard to retrieve arrows that could be salvaged and reused. found it gleaming among the debris left by the previous night's assault. A golden armband worked with intricate designs that seemed to writhe and shift in the uncertain light. At first glance, it appeared to be simple plunder, the kind of ornament that raiders might strip from wealthy victims or claim as payment for services rendered. But as Svala lifted it from the ash-covered stones, she noticed details that made her blood run cold. The metalwork was not the crude craftsmanship of barbarian smiths, but the sophisticated artistry of civilized kingdoms. More troubling still, the symbols worked into its surface were not random decorations, but a specific heraldic pattern, one she recognized from the banners that had flown over her village during the seasonal festivals. Jorund, she called, her voice carrying a note of urgency that brought the giant warrior to her side with weapons ready. "You need to see this." The armband seemed to grow heavier in her hands as she held it out for his inspection. Jorund's pale blue eyes studied the intricate patterns with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read the political currents that flowed beneath the surface of seemingly simple events. "The seal of Thorvald the merchant," he said quietly, recognition dawning in his expression like sunrise after a long night. "Your village's trademaster." "Our village's trademaster," Svala confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man who knew our defenses, our customs, our weaknesses better than anyone, save our own headman." The implications of this discovery fell upon them like stones dropped into still water, each ripple revealing new depths of betrayal that transformed everything they thought they understood about their situation. Thorvald had not merely been a merchant who dealt fairly with their community, he had been a trusted advisor, a man whose counsel was sought on matters ranging from the timing of harvests to the arrangement of marriages. Alrik, who had dragged himself from his position despite legs that trembled with exhaustion and wounds that had reopened during the night's fighting, stared at the armband with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse into ruins. "He ate at our table," he said numbly, "blessed my marriage, held my first child when she was born. When raiders struck the northern settlements 2 years ago, he was the one who advised us on how to strengthen our defenses. And every piece of advice he gave made your village more vulnerable to exactly this kind of attack," Jorund said grimly. "The guard schedules he recommended, the defensive positions he suggested, even the harvest celebrations he helped plan, all of it designed to make Grimvar's assault as efficient as possible." Svala's hand went to her mother's pendant, fingers tracing the silver links as if they could somehow anchor her to a world that made sense. "But why? Our village enriched him. We paid fair prices for his goods, trusted him with our secrets, treated him as family, because your village was never the true prize," Jorund replied, his voice carrying the bitter certainty of a man who had finally seen the full scope of the trap that had been laid. "Everything that has happened, the raids on the borderland settlements, the systematic destruction of the eastern communities, even your flight to my stronghold, all of it was orchestrated to achieve a single goal, which is," Alrik asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "To force the mountain back into the world," Jorund said simply. "To create a situation where I would have no choice but to take up arms again. To become once more the threat that certain kingdoms remember all too well." The golden armband seemed to pulse with malevolent life as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Somewhere in the eastern kingdoms, men who styled themselves lords and kings had looked at the political landscape and decided that even an exiled mountain represented too great a risk to their ambitions. But rather than risk a direct assault on his stronghold, an assault that might fail and leave them vulnerable to his legendary wrath, they had chosen a more subtle approach. They destroyed my village to create refugees, Svala said, her voice growing stronger as anger replaced shock. "They knew that if desperate people came to you for protection, you would not be able to turn them away. And once I committed to defending you, I would be forced to fight," Jorund continued. Either I would die here, eliminated without any kingdom having to openly move against me, or I would survive and be drawn back into the kind of warfare that would eventually destroy me through sheer attrition. Alrik struggled to his feet, using his makeshift crutch to support weight that his wounded leg could no longer bear unassisted. "Then we are not fighting for our lives," he said quietly. "We are fighting to prevent you from becoming what they want you to become." "No," Jorund corrected, his pale blue eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain entire battles fought and won in defense of principles that mattered more than life itself. "We are fighting because some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. The moment I allowed political calculation to override moral obligation would be the moment I became the kind of man who could orchestrate the destruction of innocent villages for strategic advantage from their position beyond the killing ground." Grimvar's raiders were preparing for what their leader had proclaimed would be the final assault. The systematic destruction of the stronghold's outer defenses had proceeded according to plan, and the fire that had consumed the grain stores and workshops had forced the defenders back into the inner keep, where their tactical advantages would be minimized. Victory seemed within reach for men who had grown accustomed to claiming whatever they desired through the application of coordinated violence. But if Grimvar had studied the tactical situation with professional competence, he had failed to understand the psychological transformation that his assault had wrought in the three people who stood against him. The discovery of Thorvald's betrayal had not broken their spirit. It had crystallized their resolve into something harder than the ancient stone from which the stronghold was carved. "They expect us to despair," Svala said, hefting her bow and checking the remaining arrows in her quiver. "They expect us to realize that we are trapped in a web of conspiracy and lose the will to continue fighting. Instead," Alrik added, settling his crossbow into a firing position that would command the main approach to the keep, "they have given us something even more valuable than hope." "Which is?" Jorund asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Certainty," both siblings replied in unison. The certainty that their cause was just. The certainty that the men arrayed against them represented not just personal threat, but moral corruption that poisoned everything it touched. The certainty that even if they fell defending this stronghold, their deaths would serve as testament to the principle that some evils must be resisted regardless of the odds against success. As the sun climbed higher into a sky painted with smoke from the previous night's fires, Grimvar raised his own banner, a crimson cloth worked with symbols that spoke of victories claimed through treachery and innocent blood spilled for political advantage. It was meant to be a signal for the final assault, the coordinated attack that would finally break the resistance that had cost him so many men and so much time. Instead, it served as a reminder of everything that Jorund had spent 7 years trying to forget, and everything that he could no longer afford to ignore. The world was full of men like Grimvar, men like Thorvald, men who saw other human beings as nothing more than pieces to be moved on a board where only their own desires mattered. Against such corruption, neutrality was complicity, and silence was consent. "They come," Alrik said, pointing to the formations of raiders beginning their advance across the scarred ground between their position and the stronghold. "Let them come," Jorund replied, hefting Skullcrusher for what he knew would likely be the last time. "Let them learn what it costs to treat honor as a commodity to be bought and sold." The child's wooden horse that sat in his private chambers, faded paint and worn edges, speaking of love that transcended death, seemed to watch through painted eyes as the mountain prepared to become once more what legends claimed he had always been. Not a killer who took life for pleasure, but a guardian who gave life meaning through the willingness to sacrifice everything in defense of what mattered most. Behind them, the rune stones that marked the boundaries of sacred obligation caught the morning light like beacons calling the faithful to their final duty. Ahead of them, men who had mistaken temporary advantage for permanent victory, began to discover the difference between conquering the defenseless and defeating those who had chosen to stand firm against the darkness. The sheer true battle was about to begin in the pre-dawn darkness before what they all knew would be their final stand. Jorund descended into the deepest chamber of his stronghold's keep, where his ancestors had stored the most precious artifacts of their lineage. Here, wrapped in oiled leather and secured in a chest carved from heartwood that had grown for centuries before the first Halfdanarson claimed this peak, lay his father's shield, a disc of iron-bossed oak that bore the scars of 100 battles but had never been broken. The shield told its own story in the language of war. Axe cuts that had been filled with molten bronze spoke of the siege of Ironhold. Arrow holes, carefully plugged with wooden dowels, marked the stand at Raven's Bridge, where his father had held the crossing against impossible odds. Most prominent of all was a great dent in the iron boss, shaped by the hammer of a giant berserker whose name had been feared across 3 kingdoms until the day he met Gunnar Halfdanarson in single combat. As Jorund lifted this legacy from its resting place, he felt the weight of more than wood and metal settling across his arm. This shield had protected not just his father, but the principles that the Halfdanarson line had sworn to uphold: the protection of the innocent, the resistance to tyranny, the willingness to stand firm when others would yield. Now it would serve one more time in what might well be the final battle worthy of its storied history. Above in the main hall, Alrik and Svala made their own preparations, with the quiet efficiency of people who had accepted that survival was less important than the manner of their dying. Alrik, despite wounds that should have confined him to a sickbed, methodically prepared the crossbow mechanisms that would give them the best chance of making their ammunition count when the final assault came. His farmer's hands, accustomed to the maintenance of tools upon which lives depended, performed each task with the careful attention that comes from understanding that there would be no second chances. "Tell me about your wife," Svala said quietly, as she helped her brother adjust the bandage on his wounded thigh. "I want to remember her as she was, not as we last saw her." Alric's face softened with memories that transcended the horror of recent days. "Astrid had the strongest laugh," he said. "She could make even the grimmest winter day seem bright just by finding something to delight in. When she was carrying our child, she would sing to her belly every evening, old songs our mother had taught us. She said the baby needed to know the music of our people before she knew anything else." "What songs?" Svala asked, though she already knew the answer. "The lullabies about brave warriors and wise women, the ballads of love that conquers hardship, the working songs that make labor feel lighter." His voice caught slightly. "She wanted our daughter to grow up believing that the world was fundamentally good, despite all evidence to the contrary." Svala's hand went to her mother's pendant, and for a moment both siblings allowed themselves to remember a world where such innocence was possible. But that world, if it had ever truly existed, was gone now, burned away in the fires that had consumed their village and everyone they had loved. When Jorund emerged from the depths of the keep, his father's shield on his arm and his grandfather's war hammer in his hand, Alrik and Svala saw him not as the exile who had offered them sanctuary, but as the legend who had shaped the political landscape of 2 kingdoms through the application of controlled violence in service of principles larger than himself. The transformation was complete. The mountain had returned, and the earth itself seemed to tremble with anticipation of what was to come. "They will come with the dawn," Jorund said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had fought enough battles to read the rhythms of warfare like a familiar song. "Grimvar will want the full light to coordinate his assault, and he will expect us to be weakened by a night spent fighting fires and tending wounds." "Are we weakened?" Svala asked. "In some ways," Jorund admitted. "We have less ammunition than we began with. The outer defenses are compromised, and we are all carrying injuries that will slow our reactions when speed becomes critical. And in other ways," Alrik prompted. "In other ways, we are stronger than we have ever been," Jorund replied. We know why we fight. We trust each other completely. And we have nothing left to lose except our honor, and that we will not surrender while breath remains in our bodies. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, the sounds of preparation echoed across the valley as Grimvar's forces made ready for their final assault. But these were not the confident sounds of an army certain of victory. They were the grim preparations of men who had learned that their opponents would not yield easily, and who understood that even victory would come at a price that would haunt the survivors for years to come. From his vantage point on the highest tower of the keep, Jorund could see the full scope of the force arrayed against them. 40 men, armed and armored according to their station and skill, led by a commander whose reputation had been built on the systematic destruction of communities that could not adequately defend themselves. It should have been overwhelming. 3 defenders, limited ammunition, compromised defenses against professional warriors with superior numbers and equipment. But as Jorund looked down at the army that had come to destroy him, he felt no fear, only a kind of profound sadness for the waste that such violence represented. These men might have been farmers, craftsmen, traders, productive members of communities that valued creation over destruction. Instead, they had chosen to follow a path that led inevitably to this moment, when their lives would be measured not by what they had built, but by how well they could tear down what others had created. "There," Svala said, pointing to a figure near the center of the raider formation, the tall one with the red braids and the decorated armor. "That must be Grimvar himself." Even at this distance, the raider leader commanded attention through sheer presence. He moved among his men with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, and the way his followers positioned themselves suggested both respect and fear. This was not a man who led through inspiration, but one who commanded through the demonstrated willingness to visit terrible consequences upon those who disappointed him. "He will hang back during the initial assault," Jorund observed. "Men like Grimvar understand that dead leaders cannot enjoy the fruits of victory. He will send others to test our defenses and only commit himself when the outcome is no longer in doubt. Then we make sure the outcome remains in doubt for as long as possible," Alrik said, checking the mechanism of his crossbow one final time. "We do more than that," Jorund corrected. "We make him understand that some victories cost more than they are worth." The conversation that followed was unlike any that had passed between them before. Not the desperate planning of people hoping to survive, but the quiet discussion of warriors preparing to die well. They spoke of fields of fire and defensive positions, of how to make each arrow and crossbow bolt count for maximum effect, of the precise timing that would allow them to extract the greatest possible price from their enemies before the inevitable. But beneath the tactical discussion ran a deeper current, the unspoken understanding that they had found in each other something worth preserving, even if that preservation could only be achieved through the ultimate sacrifice. Jorund had discovered that exile need not mean isolation, that even in the borderlands there were people whose courage and loyalty could rekindle the flame of purpose that grief had nearly extinguished. Alrik and Svala had learned that strength could be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes strangers proved more faithful than family. As the sun broke free of the eastern peaks and painted the valley with the golden light of morning, Grimvar raised his banner, the signal for an assault that would either crush the last resistance in this corner of the borderlands or break itself against defenses that had been built not just from stone and timber, but from the unshakable conviction that some things mattered more than mere survival. "Whatever happens in the next hour," Jorund said, his pale blue eyes reflecting the sunrise like winter ice touched by flame, "know that you have both proven yourselves worthy of any company, in any hall, among any warriors who have ever drawn breath in defense of what they held dear. And you," Svala replied, her hand resting on the silver pendant that connected her to generations of women who had loved fiercely and sacrificed greatly, "have shown us what it means to stand firm when the world seems determined to wash away everything we value." Alrik nodded, his farmer's hands steady on the weapon that would soon speak for all of them in the universal language of those who refuse to yield. Then let us make this stand one worthy of the songs that will be sung when the skalds speak of the day the mountain returned. Below them, the earth trembled with the thunder of hoofbeats as 40 mounted warriors began their charge toward the stronghold that had defied them for too long. Above them, the ancient rune stones caught the morning light and seemed to pulse with the accumulated power of oaths sworn across the generations by men and women who understood that honor was not a luxury to be discarded when times grew hard, but the very foundation upon which civilization itself rested. The final battle had begun, and legends would be written in whatever blood was spilled before the sun reached its zenith. The banner of the mountain had not flown above the Halfdanarson stronghold for 7 years. Its deep blue fabric with the silver hammer worked in ancient threads, carefully preserved, in the same chest that had held his father's shield. As dawn broke over the valley, and Grimvar's forces began their final advance, Jorund unfurled this symbol of his lineage and raised it above the keep's highest tower, not in defiance, but in declaration that some oaths transcended the desire for peace. The banner caught the morning wind and snapped taut with an authority that carried across the valley like the voice of legend made manifest. Even Grimvar's most hardened veterans felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air as they recognized the significance of that symbol. The mountain had not merely awakened, he had reclaimed his place in the world, and the earth itself seemed to acknowledge his return with a tremor that ran through stone and soil alike. From his position on the ramparts, Jorund watched the approaching army with the calm assessment of a man who had faced such moments before and survived through the application of skill, will, and the kind of tactical thinking that turned disadvantage into opportunity. 40 mounted warriors in formation, advancing at the steady pace that would bring them to his walls with maximum impact and minimum warning. Professional work, executed by men who understood their craft, but professionals, Jorund had learned, often fell victim to their own competence. They planned for expected resistance and found themselves unprepared when enemies refused to behave according to tactical doctrine. Alrik, he called to the wounded farmer, who had positioned himself at the eastern firing point. When they reached the outer marker stones, target the horses. Not the riders, the horses. Make them fight on foot. The eastern approach is too narrow for a proper cavalry charge anyway, Alrik replied, his crossbow already trained on the advancing formation. But dismounted men move slower and bunch together. Exactly, Jorund confirmed, then turned to Svala at her position, covering the northern approaches. They will try to split their force, half to pin us down with direct assault, half to find an alternate route to the walls. Your job is to make sure no one reaches the blind spots below the tower foundations. The first flight of arrows came not from the defenders, but from the attackers. A volley of shafts intended to suppress defensive fire during the crucial moments of their approach. Most struck harmlessly against stone walls, designed to turn aside such attacks. But several found gaps in the defenses and forced the defenders to duck behind cover that reduced their own effectiveness. Jorund's response was swift and devastating. Skullcrusher, his grandfather's warhammer, proved as effective as a throwing weapon as it had been in close combat. The massive head, weighted with iron and edged with steel, struck the lead rider with enough force to crush armor, bones, and the hope of easy victory in a single impact. Horse and rider went down in a tangle of limbs that sent the following ranks scrambling to avoid the sudden obstacle. Now, Jorund shouted, and Alrik's crossbow sang its deadly song. The bolt took the second rider's horse in the chest, a clean kill that sent the animal tumbling and its rider flying through the air to land hard against the stone-retaining wall that channeled attackers into predetermined zones. More horses fell as Svala's arrows found their marks, each shot placed with the precision of someone who understood that wounded animals were more dangerous than dead ones. Within moments, The coordinated cavalry charge had dissolved into chaos as unmounted warriors struggled to maintain formation while dodging the thrashing hooves of injured horses and avoiding the continuing fire from defenders who seemed able to place every shot exactly where it would do the most damage. But Grimvar had not earned his reputation by giving up when initial tactics failed. Even as his mounted assault collapsed into confusion, teams of raiders with scaling ladders and siege equipment were moving to exploit the blind spots that every fortification possessed. These men moved with the careful precision of soldiers who had studied their target and identified its weaknesses through careful observation. Svala's arrows found them. Anyway, her position in the northern tower provided sightlines that the raiders had not anticipated, and her accuracy proved devastating to men who had expected to approach the walls under cover. Each shaft struck with the fury of someone who fought not just for survival, but for vengeance against those who had destroyed everything she had ever loved. The battle settled into the grim rhythm that Jorund recognized from a dozen similar encounters. Thrust and parry, attack and defense, the steady exchange of violence that would continue until one side lacked the strength or will to continue. But this was not the wild melee of barbarian warfare or the formal combat of civilized armies. This was the methodical application of lethal force by people who understood that technique. Mattered more than passion when lives hung in the balance. From the courtyard below came the sound of splintering wood as raiders, with axes, began attacking the reinforced gates that provided access to the keep itself. The iron-bound oak held against the first assault and the second, but each blow weakened the structure and brought the attackers closer to breaching the final barrier between them and their quarry. "The gate will not hold much longer," Alrik called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "It does not need to hold much longer," Jorund replied, hefting his war spear and checking the edge on the seax at his belt. "Soon enough, they will be close enough to reach with steel instead of arrows, and in the distance, moving with the deliberate pace of a predator who knew his prey was trapped, Grimvar himself began advancing toward the stronghold where the mountain waited to remind the world why some names echo through the ages. Long after the men who bore them have passed into legend, the gate gave way with a sound like thunder rolling. Through mountain passes, iron hinges torn from stone moorings by the concentrated fury of men who had paid too high a price to retreat now. Through the splintered remains of oak that had stood for 3 generations came Grimvar the Red himself, his cursed blade naked in his hand and his eyes burning with the cold fire of someone who had finally cornered the legend that had haunted his ambitions. Ragnar's Bane. They called that sword, forged from steel that had tasted the blood of kings and tempered in the tears of widows. Its edge held enchantments worked by smiths who understood that some weapons were meant for more than mere killing, that the greatest blade served as instruments of destiny itself. In Grimvar's hands, it hummed with malevolent energy that seemed to drink light from the air around it, leaving shadows that moved independently of their sources. But if Grimvar commanded attention through the dark magnificence of his weapon and reputation, it was Jorund who dominated the courtyard through sheer presence. The mountain stood in the center of the space like a force of nature given human form, his father's shield unmarked despite the arrows that had struck it, his grandfather's war hammer gleaming with fresh blood, his pale blue eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain entire battles fought and won in defense of principles that mattered more than life itself. "So," Grimvar said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them, "the exile returns to remind us why legends are written in blood." "I never left," Jorund replied simply. "I merely waited for someone worthy of my attention." The insult struck Grimvar like a physical blow, and his response came in the form of a charge that covered the distance between them with inhuman speed. Ragnar's Bane swept in a horizontal arc designed to take Jorund's head from his shoulders, but the mountain's shield intercepted the cursed steel with a sound like breaking thunder. The impact sent sparks cascading across the ancient stones of the courtyard, and both warriors staggered under the force of contact between legendary skill and supernatural malice. But it was Jorund who recovered first, his warhammer sweeping upward in a stroke that would have crushed Grimvar's ribs if the raider leader had not twisted desperately aside. Around them, the battle continued with desperate intensity as the surviving raiders pressed their assault against defenders who refused to yield. Alrik, his wounded leg finally giving way beneath him, had taken position behind an overturned cart and was methodically placing crossbow bolts in targets that presented themselves with suicidal clarity. Each shot counted now. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, and every miss brought the enemy closer to overwhelming their position. Svala moved through the chaos like a dancer whose steps were written in violence, her bow singing its deadly song as she sent shaft after shaft into raiders who thought they had found openings in the defense. Her mother's pendant caught the light as she moved, the silver links seeming to pulse with each heartbeat as if the spirits of her ancestors were guiding her aim. But it was the duel between Jorund and Grimvar that held the true balance of the battle. Two masters of their craft, each representing a different understanding of what strength meant and how it should be wielded. Grimvar fought with the fluid grace of someone who had perfected the art of taking life for personal gain, every stroke calculated to maximize damage while minimizing risk. Jorund countered with the implacable determination of a man who had learned that some things were worth dying for. His defense absolute and his attacks carrying the weight of accumulated justice. The cursed blade shrieked as it struck Jorund's shield again and again, its supernatural edge beginning to bite into oak and iron that had turned aside the weapons of champions. But each successful strike cost Grimvar blood as Jorund's hammer found gaps in armor that experience had taught him to recognize and exploit. "You cannot win," Grimvar gasped as they separated briefly, both warriors breathing hard from the sustained intensity of combat. "Even if you kill me, my men will finish what I started. Your legend ends here. My legend began when I chose to stand for something larger than myself," Jorund replied, blood flowing from a dozen minor wounds, but his voice steady as granite foundations. "It will end only when there is no one left who remembers that choice." The final exchange came with brutal swiftness. Grimvar, desperate to end a fight that was turning against him, committed everything to a thrust that should have pierced Jorund's heart. But the mountain had faced such desperation before, and his response was as inevitable as sunrise after the longest night. His father's shield caught the cursed blade at the perfect angle, deflecting its point just enough to send it past his body. Ragnar's bane, the sword that had drunk the blood of kings, struck the ancient stones of the courtyard and shattered like glass meeting granite. Skullcrusher fell like the judgment of gods, and Grimvar the Red learned too late that some legends are written in iron and truth rather than fear and reputation. As the raider leader's body struck the ground, his surviving followers felt the last of their courage drain away like water from a broken vessel. The mountain stood victorious among the corpses of those who had dared challenge the fundamental truth that some men cannot be broken, bought or intimidated into abandoning the principles that define them. The battle was won, but the cost of victory would echo in the memories of the survivors for whatever years remained to them. In the aftermath of violence, when the last echoes of battle had faded into the mountain silence, and the smoke from burning structures had begun to dissipate on the evening wind, the true work of victory began. The courtyard of the stronghold lay littered with the detritus of war, broken weapons, torn banners, and the still forms of men who had gambled their lives on the wrong cause and lost. Everything in the reckoning, Jorund moved among the fallen with the careful attention of someone who understood that even enemies deserved the dignity of proper burial. His body bore the marks of combat, a dozen minor wounds that would heal, bruises that would fade, and the bone-deep weariness that came from sustaining maximum effort for hours at a time. but his pale blue eyes held a peace that had been absent for 7 years. The quiet satisfaction of a man who had remembered his purpose and found it worthy of the price paid to fulfill it. Alrik sat propped against the stone wall of the keep, his wounded leg finally receiving the attention it desperately needed. Svala knelt beside him, her skilled hands cleaning and binding wounds that spoke of courage far beyond what anyone had the right to expect from a farmer who had never sought conflict with any man. The crossbow that had served him so well lay within easy reach, its mechanism still ready, despite the battering it had received during the long fight. "Will you live?" Jorund asked, settling beside them with the careful movements of someone whose body was reminding him that he was no longer the young warrior who had first earned the name Mountain. "I will live," Alrik confirmed, his voice steady despite the pain that clouded his features. "Though I suspect I will walk with a limp for whatever years remain to me. Honorable scars," Svala said, her fingers gentle as she secured the fresh bandages. "They will remind you that when the moment came to choose between safety and principle, you chose principle." Around her neck, her mother's silver pendant caught the light of the setting sun, its intricate knotwork seeming to pulse with the rhythm of her breathing. But now there was something new in the way she wore it, not just as a connection to the past, but as a bridge between what had been lost and what might yet be built from the ashes of tragedy. As they worked to tend the wounded and honor the dead, a comfortable silence settled over the 3 survivors. Not the silence of emptiness, but the quiet that comes when people who have shared something profound recognize that words are inadequate to express what they have experienced together. They had faced the darkness that periodically swept down from the eastern wastes, and they had not been found wanting. The stronghold itself bore the scars of siege as clearly as its defenders bore the marks of battle. The outer buildings would need to be rebuilt. The gates required replacement, and countless small repairs demanded attention before winter made such work impossible. But the walls stood firm, the keep remained unbreached, and the foundation upon which everything rested had proven strong enough to bear whatever weight the world might place upon it. It was while they prepared the evening meal from supplies salvaged from the damaged stores that Svala presented her gift to Jorund, a small wooden carving that she had worked on during the quiet hours when exhaustion made sleep impossible. The figure was unmistakably meant to represent him, carved with a kind of attention to detail that spoke of genuine affection and understanding. "It is not much," she said, placing the carving carefully on the table between them, "but I wanted you to have something that would remind you of what we accomplished here." Jorund lifted the small figure, studying the way she had captured not just his physical appearance, but something essential about his character. The stance of someone who would not yield, the expression of someone who had chosen duty over comfort, the hands that could create as well as destroy. It was the work of someone who had seen him clearly and found him worthy of preservation in memory. "This is how legends are truly made," he said quietly. "Not in the songs of skalds who never witnessed what they sing about, but in the memories of those who stood beside us when standing mattered most." As the days passed and word of the battle spread through the borderlands, travelers began arriving at the stronghold with tales of the changes that Grimvar's defeat had wrought across the eastern territories. The raiding bands that had terrorized isolated communities for months had melted away like snow before spring sun, their leaders dead or fled, and their followers scattered to the winds. Villages that had lived in fear were beginning to rebuild, and trade routes that had been abandoned were slowly returning to life. But perhaps the most significant change was the one that had occurred within the walls of the stronghold itself. Where once a solitary exile had tended his garden and contemplated the weight of old grief, now a family had formed, not bound by blood, but by the stronger ties of shared sacrifice and mutual respect. Alrik's knowledge of farming and construction proved invaluable in the work of rebuilding, while Svala's practical intelligence and organizational skills transformed the stronghold from a hermit's retreat into a genuine home. Jorund himself found purpose not in the pursuit of glory or the accumulation of wealth, but in the simple satisfaction of protecting something worth preserving. The child's wooden horse that had watched over his solitary years now shared its place of honor with Svala's carving, and together they served as reminders that love could transcend loss and hope could survive even the darkest seasons. The rune stones that marked the boundaries of the stronghold caught the light of each new dawn and seemed to pulse with renewed vitality. Their ancient inscriptions, speaking of oaths, fulfilled and duties discharged with honor. The mountain had returned, not as a force of destruction, but as a guardian, whose presence made the borderland safer for all who sought to live in peace. When winter finally settled over the peaks and valleys with its blanket of snow, 3 figures could be seen moving about the stronghold with the comfortable familiarity of people who had found their place in the world. They had faced the worst that evil men could devise, and they had not merely survived, they had prevailed, and in prevailing, had proven that some things matter more than mere existence. The legend of the mountain would live on in the songs of future generations. But the reality was better than any legend. A man who had learned that exile need not mean isolation, that family could be chosen as well as inherited, and that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in enemies defeated, but in innocence protected and principles preserved. In the quiet of evening, as firelight danced across ancient stones and the wind carried the promise of spring still months away, they sat together and planned for tomorrow. 3 people who had discovered that home is not a place but a choice, and that some choices are worth defending with everything you have and everything you are.